number one, Trump ripped up the first Iran deal. That's why we're here. And then number two, the deal that at some point President Trump started demanding was a deal that Iran could never agree to, would never agree to, and that was known from the start.
So recently, Glenn Greenwald had a podcast where he talks about the reality of the ceasefire deal that was just reached between Iran and Israel, arranged in some way by Donald Trump, the negative ramifications of that and how it played out, and what we can expect from Iran and the nuclear weapons program going forward. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Israeli-Iranian retaliation over U.S. bombings. Quote, Iran and Israel are set to end their war, informed Iranian sources have told Amwaj Media. Israel is expected to stop firing at 3:30 a.m. Jerusalem time on June 23rd, with the anticipation that Iran will respond by also ceasing offensive military operations. Soon after, the truce will transition to a, quote, conclusion of the conflict, a senior source in Tehran explained. Confusion initially emerged over whether there was an agreement between the two sides, which has been denied by some Iranian sources. The denial of the existence of an accord is likely tied to Tehran's principled stand that it will not only resume talks with Donald Trump once Israel, that it will only resume talks with Donald Trump once Israel has stopped firing, and that since Iran was not the party that initiated the conflict, will not be the ones to end it. So there is some confusion. I have to be honest. Certainly, we've seen President Trump saying things before that were likely untrue, including his claim that President Xi of China had called him and they spoke because China was seeking to reach a deal on the trade war and the tariffs, and China vehemently denied it. And Xi said, I haven't talked to Trump about this at all.
But in this case, it does seem to be real. Since Glenn recorded this, Iran confirmed that they are on board with the ceasefire. And, you know, Trump has tweeted some insane and erratic things at times, you know, if you ask me. But in this case, I don't think he would be able to jeopardize, you know, his political career by saying that a ceasefire was reached when it's not. It looks like it's playing out as expected.
Who knows who's telling the truth? But Donald Trump is, like any politician, is prone to disinformation, prone to lying. Right up until the Israeli attack, he was saying, I hope to resolve this diplomatically, when he knew he had already authorized the war with Israel and that those statements made to the public were false, that he hoped to resolve it diplomatically. It was just a ruse to lure the Iranians into a sense of security that no attack was coming, so that there'd be some element of surprise. But
yeah, that's exactly true. We know that the U.S. delegation went from a demand of no nuclear weapons program to no nuclear enrichment, and no one was ever going to accept that the latter. That would have tanked the nuclear energy program. It would have been a poison pill that Iranians could not accept. And how far in advance Trump was sure that he was going to collaborate with Netanyahu and dupe the Iranians into this negotiation, it's not fully known, but the Iranian position never changed. They always wanted a new JCPOA. They just weren't going to give away all uranium enrichment. How could you do that? You'd tank the entire economy, and they were never going to accept that. But the U.S. changed their side at some point of this, and that's why, you know, this conflict broke out. It was Israel that struck first. There was complicity from the U.S. side at some point. How many days in advance is anyone's guess? It was at least a few, because there were evacuation orders in 1 to 2 days in advance.
At the very least, there is some basis for seeing this. We'll know in 6 hours one way or the other. There's really no need to speculate. I just wanted to give you what sides are saying about whether there's a ceasefire. This is always very touch and go. Anytime there's a ceasefire, if the Israelis go much further than they've gone, that could undermine it. If the Iranians do the same thing. But Trump is insistent that this has happened, and we will see if it's true. All right, so like I said, the key event of today is that Iran did launch a retaliatory action, but immediately became clear that those missiles were either intercepted or they landed and maybe did some structural damage to some buildings, but that nobody was killed. And after it was over, Trump went to Truth Social and he gave his version of events, which was this, quote, Iran has officially responded to our obliteration of their nuclear facilities with a very weak response, which we expected and have very effectively countered. There have been 14 missiles fired, 13 were knocked down, and one was, quote, set free because it was headed in a non-threatening direction. I am pleased to report that no Americans were harmed and hardly any damage was done. Most importantly, they've gotten it all out of their, quote, system, and there will hopefully be no further hate. I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured. Perhaps Iran can now proceed to peace and harmony in the region, and I will enthusiastically encourage Israel to do the same. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
So this was a face-saving measure. They didn't intend to do mass damage to U.S. troops in the region, which is great. This is so good that no lives were lost over this, because it really could have escalated the war. This could have led to boots on the ground. That you would have seen a dramatic retaliation then by the U.S., which was the aggressor along with Israel. So I think it's interesting here is he said he anticipated a very weak response. Well, if that's true, why did you get into this war in the first place? Well, we know the answer. It's Netanyahu and AIPAC and the Israel lobby wanting to draw the U.S. in. Ultimately, Trump did make the decision on the U.S. side, and that's how it happened. But it really disproves the neocons that thought that Iran would act in a way that, tries to wipe Israel off the map. They didn't do that. They did retaliate. They had to retaliate back after Israel strikes. They also were retaliating in ways that weren't depleting their most elite types of weaponry, not, unleashing hellfire, hoping maybe this was the situation. Yet neocons have always said they're going to wipe Israel off the map. They're going to attack all our bases in the region. All that turned out to be bogus.
It seems as though that very likely happened. That's what happened last year when Israel made very provocative steps toward Iran, including blowing up their consulate in Syria, which any country would consider an act of war, assassinating guests that Iran had invited to into their country, including for the inauguration of the new president. And Iran felt compelled to respond, and they shot a couple of hundred ballistic missiles, but used old and slow ones. They barely did any damage. Nobody was killed. At the time, we explained that it was clearly designed to be far less than what Iran was capable of doing. And as we've seen over the last 10 days, Iran is capable of striking Israel. They are capable of blowing things up in Israel. They are capable of killing Israelis, and they've done so. So that was Iran back then sort of having a symbolic retaliatory strike, not wanting to escalate things further. And it seems like today that's what they did as well. They needed to show their population, but also the world, that you can't just bomb Iran and have no retaliatory strike. But they also wanted to make sure that whatever they did in retaliation didn't force the Americans fully more into the war than Trump already had them be on Saturday night.
Yeah, so you can see that even when pushed into the deepest corner, the country that was alleging that they would act, to try to wipe Israel off the map, do the most damage imaginable in the region, not only to U.S. forces in Israel, was remarkably restrained, far more so than Israel and the United States. And by the way, Israel took out a residential complexes at the beginning of this whole thing. So, exactly.
Pretty restrained, balanced response from Iran, obviously very pragmatic, walking this fine line. And according to Trump, at least, he was appreciative to the Iranians, believed the Iranians acted responsibly, and that's why he believes that the war can now be over. But I do think there's still some important lessons to be learned from this. As I said, I spoke about some of the key lessons in that live broadcast that I did yesterday. But I want to just go over one thing in particular, because if something like this repeats again, I think it's extremely important to understand the issues that were purposely distorted, the propaganda that rained down on people to get them to support this war, including people who have been saying for a long time they don't want any new Middle East wars. And one of the most important is this issue of enrichment, enriching uranium. So I just want to give this background because I think it's so crucial. We are told that Iran is this fanatical regime desperate to get a nuclear weapon so they could wipe Israel off the map.
Right.
Obviously, if they used a nuclear weapon against Israel, there'd be no Iranian in Iran left. There'd be no more Iran. The Israelis have a massive second strike nuclear capability. The Americans have a massive strike nuclear capability. We have said under many presidents that if anyone attacks Israel with a nuclear weapon, we'll respond with our own. So you'd have to be genuinely suicidal, willing to not just sacrifice your life, but every person in your country's life, the country itself would just all instantly end. And I would suggest that Iran has done nothing to suggest that they operate in accordance with that kind of irrational suicidal tendency. The most important data point that demonstrates that's not who they are, and I think this has gotten so lost, and it's extremely frustrating because of how critical it is. Iran voluntarily entered into an agreement that was painstakingly negotiated basically by the entire world, by the US under President Obama, by Russia and China, by most of Europe, including France and the UK, the other members of the Security Council. All kinds of international organizations were involved in negotiating this deal, the purpose of which, from the Iranian perspective, was to reintegrate them back into the international community and lift sanctions so that their economy could grow. And from the Western perspective, the purpose was to make sure that there was no way Iran could have a breakout and develop nuclear weapons. And the reason why it worked, and everybody agrees it worked, the US intelligence agrees it worked, European intelligence agrees it worked, the IAEA agrees it was working. By working, I mean Iran was complying. And the whole foundation of that was Iran was saying, we insist upon our right, which every country has, to develop nuclear energy. So we're going to have reactors and centrifuges, and we're going to enrich uranium solely for nuclear energy, but we're not going to enrich uranium to the level where it's possible to get a bomb.
Yeah, and the IAEA and the US, the deep state, the entity that's most likely to drum up war propaganda, was admitting that they were complying with that they weren't trying to expand that and seek a nuclear weapon. Now, they have hung at that 60% enrichment, but only to try to create a deterrent without actually having a nuclear weapon. And it requires 90%. So any deal that would have eliminated nuclear enrichment entirely was totally off the table. It would have been unacceptable, and yet that's what the U.S. delegation, which included Witkoff, ended up demanding by the end of this thing. So this may have started earnest and honest at the beginning, but it certainly, took a turn at some point in the negotiating process, and I think that's when we can be pretty clear that they wanted war.
Prior to the Iran deal, every country in the world is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was negotiated and implemented from 1968 to 1970, and the purpose was to prevent countries that don't have nuclear weapons from obtaining them. There's only 4 countries on the planet, 4, that are not signatories to the NPT. India, Pakistan, and Israel never signed. North Korea signed and then withdrew. So those 4 countries, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Every other country in the world is a signatory to the NPT. And under the NPT, there is no limitation on how much a country can enrich uranium, to what extent they can enrich uranium. It's guaranteed that everyone who signs that agreement has the absolute right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes.
So this includes Iran, but not Israel, which, by the way, Israel has a secret nukes program that they won't admit to the world because they don't want to be subject to the restrictions that the nuclear weapons powers really are. They got those from the Americans. The Americans don't care about trying to get them to admit that. It would seem to be like the easiest thing to get, the whole country you're subsidizing to do if you want to really use your leverage in that way. But again, the Israel lobby has such control over US presidents and congressmen that they don't do that. And what's so ironic too is that it's what we know about Iran comes from what the IAEA says about them and the inspections that take place. And we don't know the extent to which Israel has nuclear weapons because they aren't inspected and they won't admit it. It's the biggest irony. It's just, what are we doing here? This is just so insane. You could write a movie plot around this thing and people wouldn't believe it because it's so crazy.
People say, well, why would Iran need nuclear energy when they're swamped with oil reserves? And the reason is because they don't want to use their oil to fuel their country. They want to sell their oil on the market, and they want to energize their country with nuclear energy. And so the key difference here, there's a very simple difference between having a nuclear energy program and a nuclear weapon program. And it's about the extent to which you're enriching uranium.
Yep.
In order to enrich uranium for a nuclear energy purpose, you have to enrich uranium, let's say up to 4%. It's like 3.6, 3.8%. In order to enrich uranium for a nuclear weapon, you have to enrich it first to 60%, and then 80%, 90%. And then you can develop a nuclear weapon. There's still a big question of how would you deliver it? How do you fit it on a missile or a warhead? But to just get the nuke to enough to test it and show the world that you have it, you need to enrich uranium at 90%. As I said, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which governed Iran prior to the Iran deal, there is no limit on how much you can enrich uranium. Countries can enrich uranium up to 99% if they want and not be in violation. The whole benefit of the Iran deal was that Iran not only agreed that they would not enrich uranium beyond 3.6 or 3.8%, but that there would be this massive inspection, monitoring, and surveillance scheme in place to ensure they kept their word. Inspectors were all over these nuclear facilities. Cameras were placed everywhere there. We could listen to what was going on. We had all kinds of different ways of monitoring and surveilling what was taking place. And that's how the world knew and was very confident that Iran not only wasn't, but couldn't pursue a nuclear weapon because they allowed all kinds of inspections, way beyond what the NPT requires for other countries, into their facilities because they wanted the world to know they weren't seeking nuclear weapons. They just want nuclear weapons for energy purposes.
And all the reports confirm from the U.S. confirm that they were complying with this, by the way. That's before Trump ripped this up. And again, I've said this in many times in many videos, but I think it's really the only good thing Obama ever did. This normalized relations. It kind of took war between the U.S. and Iranians off the table. It took the pretext that Netanyahu wants for war and regime change against Iran off the table because he couldn't say, hey, they're developing a nuclear weapon program. Well, he still said that no matter what was happening over the last 30 years. But still, it subdued the case that he could make a convincing case to draw the U.S. into it. Since Trump ripped it up, which the Israel lobby always wanted, and the Israel lobby hated that Obama did that, by the way, then, game's on. That's what led to this mess. It really is.
That deal lasted from 2015, when Iran signed it with the US, Russia, and Europe, and China. The UN Security Council ratified it. Up to 2018, when President Trump just fulfilled his campaign promise in 2016 to pull out of the deal. President Trump ran on this campaign promise. It wasn't that he claimed Iran was violating the deal. He just claimed the deal wasn't good enough for the US, that Obama was a weak negotiator, Trump would get a better deal.
That's exactly right. From that time, Trump would say stuff like, well, it just showed weakness. It was leading from behind, which, by the way, was exactly what the neocons said about it at the time. That's why they didn't want it. They said, this shows that Obama is weak. We're standing down to Iran, and this is weak. But really, it averted war. It was a good thing, actually.
Trump wasn't claiming that Iran was violating it, and there was no basis for asserting that they were. Nobody claimed that.
Right.
It was also a campaign tactic to get pro-Israel money on the side of Trump, to get American Jewish voters to vote for him.
Yeah.
Because from the beginning, Netanyahu and Israel hated this deal so much because they didn't want Iran integrated back into the world. They wanted to keep Iran isolated and broken and sanctioned. And credit to President Obama for being really the first president in a couple of decades to at least partially defy what Netanyahu wanted by entering into this deal. And in 2018, Trump made good on his promises to the Adelsons, to Israel, to neocons, and he pulled out of that deal.
I will say one of the things that Obama did, though, to placate Netanyahu and the Israelis because he signed that was he gave them additional aid. That's what set U.S. aid all the way up to about $4 billion, by the way. So, he was giving them a slice of the pie greater than they already had anyways, and they were already the greatest recipient of U.S. foreign policy aid. Netanyahu is a welfare mom. So is Zelensky. They're the two biggest ones in the world. And, that's while Americans struggle here at home, as we're shoveling money into the coffers of the Israelis and Ukrainians, and, of course, the laundering process feeds the lucrative sums to Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin too.
And once Trump unilaterally tore up that deal, and he said, oh, I'm tearing it up because I want to negotiate a new one, but never got a new one done until the end of his, for the next 2 years when he left the White House. And then for the next 4 years, President Biden didn't even try to get a new deal with Iran because Israel was so opposed to it. So you had a deal in place that was working in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons that Iran voluntarily entered into. President Trump ripped up that deal, and once he ripped up that deal, there were no longer any requirement to have this massive surveillance system in place. They had some inspection requirements under the NPT, but nowhere near as invasive and rigorous and comprehensive as the Iran deal permitted. And once he tore up that deal, President Trump, what disappeared was any limitations on Iran's ability to enrich uranium.
Right.
They were allowed to enrich it, now again, to 50%, 60%, 80%, whatever they wanted. That's what got us here. Now, once Trump got into office again at the beginning of this year, in 2025, he renewed his desire to recreate an Iran deal. And he prioritized it. He had Steve Witkoff, his primary and most reliable negotiator and envoy to the Middle East, prioritize it. They met with the Iranians many times. President Trump continued to say over and over that he was very confident a diplomatic resolution could be reached that would prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon without the need for any kind of military conflict or war.
People are now debating how honest he was about that, though, or how much this was designed from the start to be a ruse. Now, I don't take the position that this was always a ruse. I don't think that there's that much evidence for that. But at some point, it did become a ruse to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security, not thinking that an attack was about to befall them, which it was. There were supposed to be negotiations the next day after the initial Israeli attack. But at some point, this became a dupe.
And yet that never happened. We didn't get a diplomatic resolution. We got war instead. And here's why I believe strongly, and we're going to show you the evidence for it as well, that this happened. I think this is such an important point. The only way to get a deal with Iran would be to allow Iran to enrich uranium up to the level needed for nuclear energy, because Iran has always said it is an absolute red line for us. We are never giving up our nuclear energy program. We believe it's intrinsic to the right of every sovereign state. Every country on the earth has that right.
And also for medicinal purposes. You need to enrich up to like 25% for some medicines, but he's right. Glenn is right about it only needs like 3 to 5% for the energy program.
There are countries that enrich uranium without having nuclear energy. Brazil is an example, Japan, Germany, others. And we insist on the same right. We're not going to give up the right that every other country in the world has. So they were always going to insist on a nuclear energy program with reactors and centrifuges and minimal levels of enrichment. And when Steve Witkoff began the process, he was asked publicly, do you envision Iran, as part of this deal you're pursuing, to have the ability to have civilian uranium enrichment, enriching up to the levels of nuclear energy? And Steve Witkoff said, yeah, of course. You couldn't get a deal without that. Of course, Iran is going to be able to enrich uranium up to 3 to 4%.
Yeah.
And what President Trump needed to do was just get a somewhat better deal than Obama got, just throw a few things in there that weren't in the prior one, so that he could claim he got a better deal than Obama. He's a better negotiator than Obama.
Right.
But it was always going to have the same fundamentals. Iran can enrich uranium up 3 to 4%, have a major inspection scheme to ensure they're doing it like before, and in return we're going to lift sanctions and allow Iran to integrate back into the economic community. That was always the only blueprint for an Iran deal.
Yeah.
And we covered this at the time, but the people who actually wanted war with Iran, Netanyahu and Israel, the Tom Cottons, the Lindsey Grahams, devised this very devious strategy to try and manipulate President Trump, which was they pretended they also wanted a deal and agreed with Trump that the best thing to happen would be a diplomatic resolution. Because, of course, if they said, oh, President Trump is wrong, he would never listen to them again. They would lose their influence with him. So they have to say, oh, yeah, President Trump is absolutely right. We, too, agree there should be a diplomatic resolution. But they put a definition of what a diplomatic resolution has to entail that made it certain that it would never happen because Iran could never agree to it, would never agree to it. Namely, they said the only agreement that is acceptable is one that completely dismantles the entire Iranian nuclear program, not just any potential to get weapons, but also not allowing them to have any nuclear energy program.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I think this was reported in early June, like June 1st or June 2nd. In the early June days, it was reported widely that the U.S. had shifted its mentality in that direction. It's really kind of an ingenious neocon scheme, ingenious Zionist scheme, if you ask me, because they could then appear to be supportive of Trump's overarching goal of the negotiation, but while inserting this poison pill that was destined to tank it. And that's exactly what happened. It tanked it, and then we got war. We got innocent Israelis, innocent Iranians dead over this thing. And again, I'm glad that this didn't break out into the worst case scenario where so many people died. U.S. forces were targeted. It escalated the war. We had more bombs, more innocents dead, and, boots on the ground and regime change and, year after year occupation like we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm so glad it didn't come to that. But it really could have. Iran was backed into the corner, and thankfully they didn't respond how the neocons always said they would. So Glenn's totally right here. It really seems like there was a duping. And this is the U.S. dealing in bad faith with a foreign power, and even allowing Israel to undermine our stated foreign policy goals. How devious is that? And, Trump didn't reprimand Netanyahu for that. He joined in on this strike. If you're a real America First president, you have to say, Netanyahu, screw you. We're still going through with this plan despite how much you want to do a regime change in Iran and strike Iran. I'm so glad this didn't come to regime change, but this really was Israel's will overriding the U.S. foreign policy. It was really crazy.
No enriched uranium, no reactors, no centrifuges, nothing. That's the only solution. Of course, Iran was never going to agree to that. And at some point during this process, that group, that faction, convinced Trump that having a deal with Iran that prevents nuclear weapons requires Iran to give up nuclear energy completely. No enriched uranium, nothing. Even though Steve Witkoff began by saying, yeah, of course, you have to let Iran have a nuclear program and enrich uranium for nuclear energy. And that's why Trump, just 10 days before the war goes, said, I thought we were going to get a deal with Iran. I was really optimistic, but something got into them. They really changed because he was hearing back that they wouldn't sign the deal that he wanted, which was no more enriched uranium, no more reactors, no more ability to even have nuclear energy, which they were never going to agree to. So to him, in his mind, he thought we were on our way to a deal, and then suddenly Iran changed his mind and stopped. When in fact, the only thing that changed was that Trump never had a very detailed understanding of this enrichment question. And the Lindsey Grahams and Tom Cottons and Mark Levins and Sean Hannity's and Netanyahu's of the world convinced Trump that all along what he was trying to obtain was that Iran would give up all enrichment, even for peaceful purposes.
I'm not 100% sure if I agree with Glenn on this. I think Trump may have known the difference. It's hard for me to believe that Trump, who I don't think is stupid, I have a lot of policy differences than him. He doesn't really have an ideology. But I certainly have policy differences with him. And I think he may have been well aware of this and just, been too under the control of the Israel lobby to resist it, even if he had wanted it to. There's a chance he didn't fully understand it and understand, why they would be rejecting this deal. But, I think he's probably briefed on that. There's a lot of people within the deep state and probably this administration that didn't ever want any sort of deal like this to happen. But it's hard for me to believe that he never knew the difference here. This might be an area where I kind of disagree with Glenn.
That is the basis for what happened here. That is why, number one, Trump ripped up the first Iran deal. That's why we're here. And then number two, the deal that at some point President Trump started demanding was a deal that Iran could never agree to, would never agree to, and that was known from the start.
Yeah, ultimately agree with Glenn concerning how we got to this point. It certainly was over that pivot in terms of these negotiations. And, all we heard from the neocons and people that really wanted regime change in Iran was that, they would behave just as they always said, try to wipe Israel off the map and just be super bellicose, super aggressive. But they didn't. They acted in moderation, completely outside of the narrative that we were sold. And, the goalposts kept changing during this whole thing. I talked about it in my previous video about with Dave Smith covering what he said about it. But at first it was, we're going to negotiate with Iran. And then it was, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And then it was, well, Israel's doing this bombing on itself and we're going to stay out of it. Then it was, I guess we are bombing Iran, but it's awesome. And it's spectacular, mission accomplished. That was Hegseth's line, essentially. And what Trump said about it, was spectacular. Then it was regime change. Trump flirted out that tweet that said, why wouldn't there be a regime change if Iran doesn't want to make itself great again? Just absurd, just taking the total neocon line on it. And then it was, retaliation strike that was totally impotent of causing great damage. And I was glad to see that because I could kind of see what was coming at that point, and it was a better scenario than it could have been. I'm just so glad because I was very worried about a false flag attack on U.S. forces. The Israelis would have unlimited incentive to draw the U.S. into deeper war, finally consummate what Netanyahu always wanted. It doesn't seem like he has that opportunity now, at least for now. And this is going to go on. Don't get me wrong. I said this in the Dave Smith video too, but the neocons are continuing to clamor for this. You already see it. Mark Levin and Sean Hannity and, Randy Fine and all those guys are just beyond themselves right now, knowing how close they were, maybe potentially to a regime change. And that opportunity is out the window. They're probably at some bar or wallowing in their sorrows, listening to Morrissey or something like that. But it's good that happened. Hey, I'm glad that this ended up the way it did, all things considered. It still is a setback in many ways. It drives Russia closer to China for sure. When two great nuclear powers are, totally more aligned against the United States than they will be, that also gives the deep state an opportunity to drum up, China's going to overtake us tomorrow, those threats, because that alliance will probably come closer, but it really is more defensive in nature, surely. And it will also mean that every country in the world that doesn't have nukes and has the capability of creating them is automatically incentivized to do it and do it fast. Do it now. Because you see how U.S. treats these powers and Israel. We saw it in Libya and we saw it now. And then you see how the U.S. treats, even Stalin with nukes or Mao Zedong with nukes or Pakistan or India or North Korea. Even if they had aspirations of regime change in any of those countries, including North Korea, which Bush did say is part of the axis of evil. And, there was a lot of flirtation among the neocons of trying to remove that regime. Well, they're not going to do it. It's essentially taken off the table because not even the neocons talk about that because they have nuclear weapons. It's going to guarantee a nuclear war if you're going to get embroiled in that and they feel backed up enough into a corner. So why wouldn't you, if you're an Iranian, develop a nuke now? It doesn't seem like there's any disincentive to doing that now. And the U.S. and Israel caused that. That's worse than existed before. If you're of the mind that it's bad for Iran to get a nuke. I personally don't want there to be a nuclear Middle East at all, if I had my way. And that's what Iran wants. Iran has called for and signed on to the idea of having a nuclear-free Middle East. But what would that mean? That would mean no nukes for Israel. And Israel won't give that up. They have a secret nukes program. It's just such an ironic thing. There's other ramifications too. It's going to jeopardize peace in Ukraine because why would Russia trust the U.S.? I mean, we're already fighting the proxy war in Ukraine, not withdrawing aid there, not really seeming to really want to do what it takes to secure a peace, which is withdrawing aid. That's literally what it would do. But we also antagonized Iran, along with Israel. Our criminal government got involved in that, and Iran is a close ally with Russia. You had Medvedev, the former president, talk about how, Russia could provide Iran with nukes now. If that's on the table, that's just so bad. It's such a setback and such a unseen ramification of this all. So you're going to see all the Trump fanatics say what a stunning success this was, but there really are a lot of issues with it, despite admittedly, this is not as bad as it could have gotten for all the reasons I enumerated. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. How good do you think this conclusion is? At least for now, it's a ceasefire, and hey, Israel's known to violate ceasefires. We know that from Gaza. But do you think that this was a good scenario? Do you see any cause for fear regarding it? Anything you think I'm missing on it? Let me know in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, consider supporting me as a YouTube member or Patreon patron, and I'd really appreciate it. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire, all four there. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.